The inference, we think, is inevitable. The watch must have had a maker. Welcome to Philosophers, explained by me, Stephen Hicks. This series covers major philosophers and core texts in the history of philosophy, especially the great classics. From each I've selected an excerpt, 30-40 minutes or so, and our purpose is to do a close reading of an important work with the accompanying text. In this episode, we are turning to William Paley and his 1802 excerpt, The Watch and the Watchmaker, taken from his Natural Theology. Paley is discussing in the context of the Enlightenment and a vigorous discussion about the relationship between science and religion. Let's go to the text. Start with the first line here. In crossing a heath, heath is an open, uncultivated area, so Paley is positioning himself going for a walk out in nature. Suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there. All right, so out for a walk, my foot hits a stone and I stop and I get all philosophical. How did the stone get to be here? So, positioning, notice that we're starting in nature, and this is going to be a discussion about the existence of nature, the order in nature, and whether there is a God, and whether we can prove the existence of a God from evidences of nature. Now, with that said, on the first line, let's go to the title and say a few words about the title. This is a book published in 1802. And the work is called Natural Theology. And what Paley is doing, even with the title, is signaling his approach in the context of one of the great divides in discussion of religion. Suppose we are interested in God or the gods. Where do we start? How do we come to knowledge of the gods, supposing that we can get there? And one of the great answers to that question is to say that we should start with nature. We will observe nature, we will notice nature's features, and on the basis of those observed features, we will reason our way to the existence of a God. And so this is called natural theology because it gets to the gods by way of nature. And the major contrast is to revealed theology. And the answer there is, if you want to come to know God or the gods, you need to start with what has been revealed in the holy books. And there, the usual story is that God or the gods spoke to various prophets or spoke to various mystics, and those are recorded in holy scriptures, holy writings, and those are our best sources of knowledge of God. So, do we start with nature and reason our way to the gods, or do we start with mystical revelations and come to know God that way? Paley is a writer of the Enlightenment, usually dated from the late 1600s or so, carrying on and with a very vigorous discussion then during the Enlightenment of what the place of religion is now that we are more naturalistic, more worldly, and over the course of the past couple of centuries, science has made impressive progress in grounding itself and coming to know nature. Is it the case, as some will then want to argue, that science and religion are therefore opposed to each other, particularly when their answers seem to be in tension with each other, that therefore we either need to be rational and scientific, or we need to be irrational and religious, or is it the case that really religion properly conceived and science properly done are ultimately going to be compatible? Paley is very much in that latter tradition, the compatibilist position. Rational religion, science-based religion should come to one and the same thing. And in this watch and the watchmaker argument, we have a very deservedly famous analogy that Paley uses to develop the argument. So let's see how this analogy works. So in crossing the heath, I pitch my foot against the stone and I stop and I wonder, okay, where does the stone come from? What's the explanation for why the stone is where it is? Then he says, well, I might possibly answer that. For anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. So we could say, the stone just exists. There's no particular reason or purpose why the stone exists, and it's just existed there for all time. There's no intelligence or being that decided to place that stone there for a particular reason, or perhaps one of the reasons was that he knew that William Paley eventually was going to go for a walk and kick a stone and start to think about cosmological things and so forth. So maybe the stone just exists. There is no intention or purpose behind what it is. It just exists as a brute natural fact forever. But carrying on, suppose I found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer which I had given, that for anything I knew the watch might always have been there, would be an acceptable answer. So if instead of the stone, I'm going for my walk and I kick up against something and I bend down and I pick it up and I say, oh, it's a watch. And I'm looking at the watch and I say, how did the watch get to be here? And I say, well, maybe the watch has just been there forever and there's no intention behind why the watch exists or where it happens to be positioned. It's just kind of a brute random fact of nature, just like the stone. And then we say, no, that's got to be ridiculous. That's not an acceptable answer. So Paley then says, well, why not, right? Yet why should not this answer serve for the watch as well as for the stone? And then as a natural theologist, he says, well, let's actually look. We look at the stone and we notice its parts and how it seems to be put together, its color, its textures, maybe we smell it and so forth. And on the basis of that, we draw some conclusions about the stone. We do the same thing about the watch. Let's observe very carefully the constitution of the watch. We perceive, right, what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose. So when I look at the stone, it's conceivable that the stone has no purpose to the way it's put together. When I look at the watch, I seem to perceive that it was put together for a purpose. Now that's a kind of intermediate conclusion that we will reach, but why might we say there's got to be a purpose at work? And then again, we look more closely at the different parts of the watch. If the different parts had been differently shaped from the size what they are, or if they were of a different size, or if they were placed next to each other in a different manner or in any other order, no motion at all would have been carried out on in the machine. So if we look at all of the parts and how they are all put together, we see if they had been put together in any different way, the watch would not be subject to watch-like movement. And so it seems like only this particular arrangement of the parts could have given rise to the movement of the parts. And then we look again more closely at all of the different parts. There's a cylindrical box. And it's perfectly cylindrical, containing a coiled elastic spring, and the spring also has regular movements. A flexible chain, but the parts of the chain, the links of the chain are evenly spaced and linked together in a pattern. There's a connection to the fusee, which is a kind of cylindrical what's the word I'm groping for here? A pulley, perhaps. Then we find a series of wheels, and the teeth are all irregularly shaped and interconnected with each other. There's a balance. The balance is connected to a pointer. Then if we look at the materials, the wheels are made of brass, and we know that brass is rust resistant. The springs of the steel are very strong, and they maintain their shape despite being somewhat elastic. On the cover of the watch, that's made of glass. It's not made of steel or made of brass, because the glass is transparent and we can see through it, so we can observe what the motion is going on. So when we look at all of these parts and how they're all connected to each other and how they're all made of just the right materials to serve the given purpose, the inference, we think, is inevitable. Right? And so now we're drawing a conclusion based on what we have observed and observed carefully. Is inevitable. The watch must have had a maker. All right, so notice the order of our operations here. We start in nature, We are using our senses and we are perceiving, we are observing very closely, we are noticing the connection between all of the parts that we are drawing and on the observing rather, and then on the basis of that we are logically making an inference, and then we are judging the strength of that inference as well. Okay, so watch exists. The watch must have had a maker, so we can say from the existence of the watch, given its order and its complexity, there must be a watch maker. And we don't necessarily want to say that has to be the case for the stone. Maybe there is no purposeful stone maker. Now, this next section is important methodologically, and I want to scope through here. Because notice what Paley is doing. He's made an argument for the existence of a watchmaker. Now, in the back of our minds, we know that really we're making an argument for the existence of God. The analogy is setting us up for that analogy to be drawn. But what Paley also does is not simply say, the watchmaker exists and it's an article of faith. He's giving you an argument for the existence of God. And what then is characteristic of individuals who are committed to observation and inference on the basis of argument and rationally and logically assessing the strength of those arguments is a recognition that sometimes people don't see the force of the argument, that they might draw a different conclusion or a different hypothesis, and they might object to the argument that you have made and bring into the discussion some countervailing points. And there's then a question about one's attitude of openness or not to objections to the argument. Do you dismiss them, or do you take those objections into account and then mount a counter-argument? And what we see consciously and explicitly in Paley's methodology is that rational argumentation methodology, which means openness to counter-argument. And if we just scan through for a moment, in the first case he's saying, well, here's something that might weaken the conclusion. So here's someone's objection, and I'm going to deal with that objection. And then secondly, here's another reason why someone might object to the conclusion that I've made. And a third reason, and a fourth reason. And as we scroll through, we're going to find he considers 8 possible objections. And that then is speaking volumes of the quality of his commitment to rationality. We observe, we make our hypothetical inference, we judge it therefore not to be a hypothesis anymore, it must be an inevitable conclusion, but we understand that other people might have objections to the argument that we are made, and so we're going to pay attention to those counter-arguments, we're going to list all of those objections, and then we will respond to those objections. That's how, as enlightened individuals, we make up our minds about issues, particularly complicated issues. So let's consider some of the objections. Maybe this argument and its inference is not as inevitable as it first seemed. So, nor would it I apprehend, weaken the conclusion that we had never seen a watch made, that we had never known an artist capable of making one, or that we were altogether incapable ourselves, right, of executing such a piece of workmanship, or of understanding them in what manner it was performed. So, what if someone then said, okay, I understand your argument here, William, but, I've never seen a watch made. I don't know how to make a watch. I don't even understand the process. So how can I be so sure then that the watch here must be made? And Paley wants to then argue, well, this doesn't turn on you individually knowing how to make a watch, or even in general terms understanding how the watch is made, or even having seen a watch being made. Given the evidence of your eyes so far, you can see that it's a rational inference to do so. It doesn't turn on your having particular additional knowledge. We have a sufficient amount of knowledge here. So we'll set that aside as an objection. Well, what if someone said, well, look at this watch, and you're wanting to say it's made by a watchmaker, but sometimes it goes wrong, right? Or so it's not always exactly the time. So this is perhaps not a very good watch, or it's not a perfect watch. And then Paley wants to say, okay, so maybe this is not a perfect watch, but the fact that it's an imperfect watch doesn't mean that it doesn't need a watchmaker to have made it. Instead, the inference would probably just be that maybe a pretty good watchmaker instead of an expert watchmaker, or the watchmaker may have had a bad day, or of course something could have happened to the watch after it was made and it's not working as well and needs some repair. So the perfection of the watch is not an argument against it still needing a watchmaker. Nor, third objection, would it bring any uncertainty into the argument if there were a few parts of the watch concerning which we could not discover or had not yet discovered in what manner they conduced to the general effect. So, suppose the objection then is, we look at the parts, we see the springs, the fusee, the glass, then we see, oh, I know what all of those things are doing. And then I look close and there seems to be a little part in here, and what does that do? I have no idea. Therefore, the watch doesn't need a watchmaker because this one part seems to be superfluous, or I just don't understand why it's there. Paley wants to say the fact that we don't know the reason for that particular part does not defeat the conclusion that still all of the other parts of the watch, and probably that part as well, are there for a reason, and that the watchmaker must have put them there for a reason. All right, carrying on, a fourth objection. Nor, fourthly, would any man in his senses think the existence of the watch with its various machinery accounted for by being told that it was one out of possible combinations of material forms, that whatever he had found in the place where he had found the watch must have contained some internal configuration or other, and it might just be like this one. So the idea here is then to say, so we take all of these parts that go and materials that go into the watch. Well, the way the world is, everything has to be there in some particular configuration, and it just happens to be that this particular configuration is the configuration that makes it look something like a watch to us. But there's a billion possible configurations. One of them has to be realized. It could have been some other one, but it just happens to be this one, and so therefore there doesn't need to be a watchmaker. And so there's a probabilistic argument at work in this objection. And then Paley would respond to that and say, well, look, okay, out of all of those billions of possible configurations, how many of them would have led to a configuration in which the watch pointer is moving with regular motion such that we can keep time? And that's a 1 in a billion or a 1 in a trillion or whatever number you want to assign it chance, and that's not a reasonable objection. All right, fifthly, what about this objection? Instead of saying that there needs to be a watchmaker, we can just say the kind of operative out there in the world, there's this principle of order, and that principle of order generates watches, right, sometimes. Would it yield his inquiry more satisfaction to be answered that there existed in things a principle of order, which had disposed the parts of a watch in their present form and situation? And then Paley gets a little bit sarcastic here. He says, well, he never knew a watch made by the principle of order. So there aren't all these just principles just floating around out there that are doing various things, or principles of order that make watches. So show me a principle of order that makes watches. I have no idea really what that means. Instead, what makes sense to me is to say that there is a watchmaker, and the watchmaker does everything that we can maybe call principled ways of action or principled ways of ordering things, but then the principle of order is a description of the watchmaker. It's not just this free-floating thing out there in the world. Sixthly, another objection. Well, maybe nature is being a little bit tricky here, and it's just trying to make us think that there is a watchmaker when really it's just some sort of random causal processes or whatever. You would be surprised to hear that the mechanism of the watch was no proof of contrivance, only a motive to induce the mind to think so. So perhaps we've read our René Descartes in his early meditations, where he's talking about the evil genius, and the evil genius is just arranging nature in a way to try to trick us into thinking that there's a watchmaker who made this watch, but ha ha ha, there isn't really, or some other sort of motivation at work in the universe. So Paley then seems to be suggesting, let's stay away from conspiracy theories. Nature doesn't try to trick us. Nature just is the way it is. And if it's a reasonable inference that a watchmaker must have made the watch, let's not get all weird in our speculative hypotheses about it. Number 7, and not less surprised to be informed that the watch in his hand was nothing more than the result of the laws of metallic nature. So perhaps this is a variation, a more specific variation on the principle of order objection earlier. So as we just said, well, there are various laws operative or principles operated in the nature of metals, and metals just have to come together in certain configurations and so on, but there's no intentional watchmaker activity at work here. And Paley then wants to say, well, let's not manipulate language too much here. If we're going to talk about laws, then we have to talk about a law giver, or a law agent, or an agent who is acting in accordance with these various laws. So rather than just saying that in some abstract, weird way, the laws are just out there doing things in nature, laws require a law follower, and they probably then require a law maker, and so we would be then back to some sort of watchmaker type of being. Neither, lastly, all right, and now we're getting to the 8th possible objection. Would our observer be driven out of his conclusions or from his confidence in the truth by being told that he knew nothing at all about the matter? So suppose we bring in a whole battery of skeptical arguments, or arguments about the general ignorance of the person. Look, the universe is so complicated and vast. There's all kinds of stuff that you don't know. And so in general purposes, we're going to say your ignorance about so much means that you shouldn't be able to make any sort of conclusion in this case and hold that conclusion with any degree of confidence. And Paley's response basically is to say, look, yeah, there are lots of things that I don't know, but that doesn't undercut what I do know. And what I do know is the evidence of my own eyes and the logical inference that there must be a watchmaker who made this particular watch. All right, so observation, logic, starting with ourselves in nature, and then a careful consideration of counter objections and reasonable responses to those. This is highly characteristic of natural theology. No mystical insights, no going by our feelings, no appeals to faith, no appeals to the authority of scriptures or institutional religions, and so forth. Use your mind, use your senses, let the best arguments prevail. Paley is an Enlightenment natural theologist. Now, just an excerpt from chapter 2, where he develops the argument and setting up for his eventual big analogy, the ultimate conclusion of the argument, because of course we're not really too concerned about where watches came from, and we might be interested in where stones come from, but this analogy between stones and watches is to set us up for the big prize to come in the next chapter. But in chapter 2, Paley makes the argument more complicated and more forceful by imagining then, and this is now by nature of hypothesis, so let's just read. Suppose in the next place that the person who found the watch should, after some time, discover that in addition to all the properties which he had hitherto observed in it, it possessed the unexpected property of producing, in the course of its movement, another watch like itself. So that then is to say, the watch, hypothetically, this is an imaginary watch, can reproduce itself. Or maybe two watches, if they are joined together, will then produce a third watch. So far we are considering inanimate nature, the stone, and we're considering an artificial object, but now we're making a suggestion of biological things that we find out in nature. And we do know one of the features of biological nature is not only that those parts then all fit together and seem to serve certain purposes as well, but they have this ability of reproduction, asexually or sexually. So what we then would say is, wow, this is even more amazing. And so the watchmaker who is able to make a watch that then can reproduce itself, that watchmaker must be something really special. As much as we might and then respect the intelligence and the technical prowess and the power of someone who can make a watch, if that watchmaker can make a watch that could reproduce itself, well, that must be a watchmaker of an even higher order of intelligence, higher order of skill, higher order of power. And of course, then we're getting closer to the natural world in its entire scope, which includes inanimate as well as animate objects as well. Now, going then on to chapter 3, the application of the argument. What's the point now, 2 chapters in, of developing this extended analogy between the stone and the watch? Well, this is going to be then a 2-step analogy, because what we are really interested in as philosophers and as theologians is the nature of the universe as a whole. Where did the universe come from? Why does it exist? And why does it exist in the form that it exists with all of its intricate moving parts and so forth? So, every indication of contrivance, every manifestation of design which existed in the watch exists in the works of nature. So we see design, we see indications of contrivance in the watch. We also see that when we look in the nature, we see evidence of contrivance, evidence of design, but with the difference on the side of nature of being greater and more, and that in a degree which exceeds all computation. The contrivances of nature surpass the contrivances of art. Here, the watchmaking as an art, in the complexity, subtlety, and the curiosity of the mechanism. So, what Paley is pointing out here is, if we take this 2-step analogy here, the reason why we are willing to say maybe there's no stone maker, right? The stone just exists and it doesn't, its parts fit together, but not for any particular purpose, and it wasn't designed. There's no contrivance here, is that the stone is relatively simple. But the relative complexity of the watch makes us then want to say there's no way that this could have just come into existence the same way we think the stone possibly could have come into existence. It is so complex that it must have a watchmaker who contrived that design for a particular purpose. And so it's the degree of complexity that leads us to hypothesize the necessity of a designer. And so if we then extend that to the next step, we say, well, nature is even more complex than the watch. And so the analogical argument holds. Therefore, nature, even more than the watch, needs a contriver. It needs a designer. It needs a nature maker. And then if we consider the relative power and the nature of the watchmaker relative to a nature maker, we have to say, well, the watchmaker has to be a very intelligent being, a very powerful being. Then, by contrast, the nature maker must be extraordinarily intelligent and extraordinarily powerful, and therefore, we are talking about a God-like being. So, by argument from an analogy, we can conclude there must be a God. And this is the standard then conception of a God as an extraordinarily intelligent, extraordinarily powerful being that created the universe and imposed an order on it for a purpose, just as by lesser analogy, the watchmaker is intelligent and powerful and imposed on some raw materials an order and a design for a particular purpose. Therefore, God exists. All right, this is a very influential argument, and it's a charming argument with its great use of a powerful example, the watch example, to bring what is often very abstract considerations about the universe as a whole into a scale that we can understand more easily. And just to re-emphasize, Paley is very much impatient with any appeals to religion that want to say that religion should be irrational, just a matter of faith, a matter of just blindly believing whatever scriptures told you or whatever institutional authorities told you. He's very much a man of the Enlightenment. He wants us to think. He wants us to use our senses, and he wants us to work with the scientists, not against the scientists. Scientific proof of the existence of God should be part of the Enlightenment project, just as the scientific proof of anything. And it's then going to have a certain kind of ethical implication about how we should think individually about forming our core beliefs, and certainly in terms of our social ethics about how we deal with other people who have different scientific hypotheses, different religious hypotheses as well. Let's look at the evidence. Let's consider the arguments and counter-arguments. Let's deal with each other as rational beings. Now, 1802 is the year Paley published the first edition of Natural Theology, and he died in 1805. I do want to make an important connection here because Paley's piece has been extraordinarily influential, but in the next generation, Charles Darwin was to come to write the argument that is most often juxtaposed to Paley's argument, and the argument between natural evolutionary theories that don't rely upon God and natural theology theories that do want to say God is a necessary part of a scientific hypothesis, is a characteristic of our debates for the last 2 centuries since then. And I do want to just read one quick quotation from Charles Darwin's autobiography, in which he makes explicit mention of Paley and Paley's influence upon him when he was younger. Darwin was born in 1809. By the time he went off to college, Darwin read everything that he could get his hands on, intellectually voracious. Paley's book had been very popular, going through multiple printings and reprintings, and was a standard text by the time Darwin went to Cambridge University. So here's Darwin, quote, "In order to pass the BA examination, it was also necessary to get up Paley's evidences of Christianity and his moral philosophy. The logic of this book, and as I may add, of his natural theology, gave me as much delight as did Euclid." So here he's referring to Euclid's geometry and the delights that he had in Euclid's geometry, that Paley's natural theology, from which we've just read excerpts, he read it well, he loved it, it was a delightful work, and he believed that the argument and the extended argument over the course of the book was valid and sound. But he then does go on to say that as his training as a scientist developed, he thought more about the vast sweeps of time, the great complexity in the world, the different ecosystems and so forth. He started to question some of those premises, and keeping with the methodology of natural theology, he started to change his mind about what the evidence suggested and where the logic of the argument went. So in one sense, he's going to be a disciple of Paley by following the natural theology method. In another way, he's going to come to disagree with Paley in reaching a different scientific hypothesis about where that evidence leads. But he says, "I did not at the time take the trouble myself about Paley's premises. And taking these on trust, I was charmed and convinced of the long line of argumentation." And so it's going to be the premises about which we are going to have the arguments still, and have had the arguments for the last 2 centuries. Yes, nature is extraordinarily complex. Is it necessary that if there is complexity, there must be a great mind that designs that complexity, or is it the case that naturalistically complexity can evolve with great amounts of time and sometimes small changes accumulating over those vast sweeps of time?